Welcome to Legacy Builders, Strategies for Building Successful Family Enterprises, brought to you by Beacon Family Office at Asante Financial Management Limited. I'm your host, Corey Gagnon, Senior Wealth Advisor, and on this show, we explore global ideas, concepts, and models that help family enterprises better navigate the complexities of family wealth. Today, we welcome Gerard McInnis, Senior Partner at Kalos LLP and Chair at MacKay CEO Forums. Gerard brings over 3 decades of experience in valuation, strategy, governance, and operations. As a private company board chair and director, he stays immersed in the current business challenges. Previously, Gerard was a partner with a Big Four accounting firm, leading their regional valuations practice and serving on the firm's partnership board. Gerard has chaired finance and risk committees for the Alberta Ballet, Junior Achievement of Canada, and currently serves on the Institute of Corporate Directors Calgary Chapter Executive. His unique combination of transaction experience and governance leadership makes him an invaluable voice in today's complex business landscape. My goal is to be the most curious person in today's conversation with Gerard McInnis, where we explore his wealth of experience in guiding businesses through valuation challenges and strategic growth opportunities. We'll discuss how Gerard's pioneering work in applying valuation principles has led him to reimagine the role of advisors, focusing on fostering value creation and strategic alignment across organizations. Together, we'll uncover how Gerard helps businesses cultivate the discipline, foresight, and governance frameworks needed to successfully navigate the complexities of capital structure optimization and exit planning. Now, let's dive in. Welcome, Gerard. We're excited to have you here today to share your wealth of knowledge and experiences with us. Let's dive in, shall we?
Yeah, I look forward to it, Corey.
Now, Gerard, imagine you're delivering the commencement speech to the graduating class of 2025, and you have the chance to inspire them with your story. How would you begin your speech to convey the incredible lessons and expertise that you've gained along your career?
Yeah, there's actually probably 4 things that come to mind for me, and maybe I'll just mention them and we could touch back on each of them. I'll start by saying embrace change, own your destiny, make your own opportunities is how I would want to frame that. Commit to lifelong learning, and most importantly, I think enjoy what you do. If you'd like, I maybe touch on each of those. Change and disruption are constants in our life.
Absolutely.
You can fight it, you can go with it. I think equally important is if you recognize that, that change is all around us. How do you equip yourself for change and take advantage of change opportunities, which really is the second point that I said, make your own opportunities. There's something I go through life with, which, I've always observed. I said, you can kind of put people, and I'm generalizing here, but you kind of put people into 3 buckets. People that make things happen, people that watch things happen, and people that don't even realize something happened. Right? And, from a career management perspective, as I look back, I was someone who always kind of created my own opportunities. And each of these points you're going to see build on each other. My third thing I said there was to commit to lifelong learning, be intellectually curious, read a lot, listen to podcasts like this, Corey, and thank you for inviting me today. But that commitment to lifelong learning, keeps your mind open, lets you anticipate change, and really is a demonstration of staying current and creating your own opportunities. So again, as I say, these things all build on each other, and enjoy what you do. I'm fortunate now, I guess, at where I am in my career, I have a little bit more flexibility, but I think I've always kind of lived my professional life this way that, if it feels like work, it likely is work.
Yep.
Right. And, right now I kind of have this saying in my life that said, if it feels like work, I don't want to do it. And I know that sounds kind of crass, but, the reality is if you really truly enjoy what you're doing, it's not going to feel like work.
Absolutely. Yep. I love that because so often people go through life struggling and feeling like they need to do it. And if it doesn't feel hard, then, they must not be doing it right. And finding that place is so important where, you can be rewarded for your efforts and, your efforts are actually enjoyable.
Exactly. And I don't mean to imply that it won't be hard. Challenging yourself is part of it, but having that predisposition to embrace that and take on the challenges, put yourself in uncomfortable situations at times. As you look back later in life, you'll look back on those, and those will be the moments you remember.
Right. And so, Gerard, through your career, you talk about equipping for change and some of those uncomfortable positions. Where would you say would be the most memorable, where you said, I took this leap and it really that change made a difference?
Yeah. Thanks for asking that. This could be the subject of a whole other podcast, but
Yeah.
I started in call it a traditional path of becoming a chartered accountant, graduate from university, become a CA. Although, I did make a life change quite early in my career. And I'm dating myself, but this was, pre-internet days, right? So to go down to New Zealand at that time, was a big move. But I did stay in, I'll call it professional services for the first seven or no, actually 11 years of my career. My big step out was to leave the accounting profession and go into industry. And I went into a role with a for-profit education company. So that was probably my biggest step out. I was at a point in my career where I was on track to be a partner. At the time was a big eight accounting firm. And, it was starting to feel too comfortable for me already. And I'm still fairly young in my career. So it was a big step out for me. I valued a company that was going public. They asked me to join their management team, and I did. And that led to the next seven, almost 8 years of my life. Lots of up and down, lots of learning. Um, Moved out of finance. I actually took operations roles. I relocated to Denver where I got to live and work for a couple of years. Unfortunately, that story from a corporate perspective didn't end well, but I took tons away from it again, personally and professionally.
Right. Gerard, you made a comment about getting comfortable, being on that partner track. And so when you look at some of the businesses that you work with and some of those families, where have they gotten comfortable? Or where do you see some of that comfort start to set in and maybe become a negative that they didn't really realize?
Again, I put my evaluator hat on and, I'll often go in when I go in to meet folks for the first time and talk about their business. I want to engage in a conversation around their strategy. And when I start to discuss strategy with them and they answer by what they do today, then I see a level of comfort that has set in, if that makes sense. So they don't talk about their organizational purpose. I say if they don't talk about their purpose, if they don't talk about what problems they solve, if they don't talk about how they consciously, strategically position themselves for competitive advantage, these are all signs to me that they're comfortable in what they're doing today and not maybe really having that foresight and perspective for not only how their business might be disrupted, because that sounds negative, but where the opportunities are to evolve the business.
Right.
Right. So it's a long way of saying, I see comfort set in when you kind of just keep doing what you're doing and keep on trucking on and thinking that that's going to carry on that way forever.
And relating that back to your three types of people and those that are making things happen. When you look at strategy, where's that balance of what you're doing today and what you're doing in the future? Because some people forget that they're solving a problem today and they're focused on something that maybe hasn't made money or isn't making money yet. So how do you look at that when it comes to valuation as well?
Yeah, again, it might be the perspective that I have on strategy. Like at the high level, it creates the guardrails and the direction for the organization. We'll probably touch on a little later on the importance of alignment because I really think there's, ties to that as well. But strategy cascades down into your actual strategic planning, into your strategic objectives, which actually feed into business planning, ultimately turns into KPIs and performance measures, personal performance measures. So if you follow that cascade, This happens sometimes in an entrepreneurial environment where you're making change too fast and it's almost like being on a boat and you're starting to get a little seasick or dizzy because it's bouncing around too much.
Right.
If you follow that cascade the way I outlined it, the closer you get down to the work that has to be done today, it's still fairly stable.
Right.
You know what you have to do, you know how you're being measured, you know what's still important today, but you can see how everything connects up to the bigger strategy. So strategies are always evolving, but the day-to-day activities should, there's a certain constant and stability that you can expect there.
Yeah. Well, and as you're explaining this, Gerard, I'm thinking about, typically people think of valuation as something that's an ownership problem or objective. And what you're talking about is how it now relates to management discussions.
Mm-hmm.
And so some of the things that I've heard from people in the past is it's quite expensive to get a valuation. I only would do a valuation if I'm going to sell, or maybe, the tax man needs it. But really, what I'm hearing you say is there's something else here where if people are understanding their strategy, there actually is a byproduct to good valuation principles.
100%. I mean, I often get asked that question around how do I create value in my business? Well, if you have a clear strategy, which really does tie to a sustainable competitive advantage, you're building in value, hopefully growing value in the business every day. Certainly, there are extraneous circumstances, economic conditions change, competitor conditions change, etc. There's only so much that you can control, but at least control the controllable.
Right.
If you feel like you have that kind of structure in place as the shareholder, or I'm looking at it from a financial value perspective, yeah, you should feel pretty confident every day that if people are executing on the plan and the plan's aligned to the strategy, then they're helping grow value in your business every day.
Right. Absolutely.
And you touched on the cost. I actually think as a profession, valuation services are good value, pardon the pun, but to learn the principles of valuation, kind of the core tenets of value, honestly, you could do that in an hour of conversation. And might just hardwire a change in your brain, a change in your thinking to start to employ kind of valuation thinking in all of the business decisions that you make. I really think it can be that simple in a sense.
Yeah. Well, and that investment and that advice and being able to think long term and just even that multiple of your investment, start today and it's something that maybe starts to actually build to the bottom line today, but maybe it doesn't. Maybe it's 3 years from now where you really start to see that pay off. I can only imagine what sort of return on investment you could see by understanding some of these principles.
100%. And again, in a family business, family enterprise perspective, and really every type of business, to be honest, I think you should always have an exit plan in mind,
Yep.
or at least build the business and think about growing value in your business from the same perspective as exit planning. And often what we find in owner managed businesses is they don't embrace that thinking, or they don't take the opportunity, I guess, to embrace that thinking maybe sooner than they could.
Right.
You're familiar with the concepts of personal goodwill, but how do you start to transition that into corporate goodwill? By building robust business practice, documenting procedures, transferring knowledge to key employees, diversifying your revenue base, diversify your customer base, et cetera, et cetera. These are all steps you could start to take. I can tell you as a fact, each one of those things I mentioned increase value in the business.
Right. And somebody who maybe traditionally, let's say we're trained by their accountant to look at the financial statements that are produced every year, and they're looking at those financial statements, how different does their thinking need to become? They've now really gotten good at understanding that profit and loss, that balance sheet, and they've always measured their progress based on balance sheet. And now we're turning things a little bit different. So how much of a change is that? And what can they do to maybe look at that in a similar fashion where they've got that cadence of review to say, are we making that progress?
Yeah, no, great question. Again, I look at a financial statement differently because as a evaluator, it tells me a story. And I think it really should tell, any user of the financial statement a story, or at least should lead you to a series of questions that you'd want to understand from what you're observing. Trends in, revenue or inconsistent revenue year over year tells me something about the resilience of the business, right? The same with margins. You can see, whether capital is being reinvested in the business or not by looking at, investments in capital assets or dividends and retained earnings being stripped out. Like, what does that tell you? I immediately look to the capital structure. Capital structure more so than probably anything impacts on value.
Right.
And we could touch on that a bit more, but I'm a big fan of appropriate use of debt, having appropriate leverage in your business, which I find is an interesting concept in the private enterprise space where often there's a debt aversion. People there's associate risk with having debt in the business. And there is, but debt is also the lowest cost of financing. And shareholder equity, common shareholder equity, is the highest cost of financing. So, even just trying to get that concept understood, if there's lower cost of financing available because the asset base accommodates that, then I'm a fan of taking advantage of that leverage. Those are just a few examples. When I look at a financial statement, I'm trying to see what are the questions it tells me around the resilience of the business, the trend, and the capital structure, and how the business is financed.
So one of the things that you mentioned at the beginning, Gerard, you said keep your mind open and stay current. And I want to bring that, and from a personal perspective as a leader, I think that there's a tremendous amount of value in that. And then I think about it of what you just said about reinvestment in the business. That's a concept of staying current. You can strip out, as you said, all those retained earnings, not be reinvesting, and start to see that business dwindle. And so, what is that? And of course, every business is unique, but what would be appropriate? Or could you give some examples where you say, oh my goodness, this really has taken the valuation down because they've been stripping it of capital for a period of time?
I guess it depends on the nature of the business too, right? And that's one of the other things when I'm looking at a financial statement, I can quickly understand the business model, to be honest, by looking at the balance sheet and having an understanding of like what kind of business they operate in. So capital intensive businesses, like say you have a truck fleet and manufacturing equipment or arguably even real estate, but it's something that's capital backed. It's a lot easier to look at it and see the historical capex spend has been, whether they're growing the fleet. If it's a fleet-based business, then or most capital intensive business, there's some type of utilization factor you can start to monitor, et cetera, right? To see whether or not, has utilization been going up such that they've had increased the availability of capital assets. So, those are signs of growth, right?
Right.
Conversely, the fleet's decreasing or utilization is going down and they've deferred maintenance on equipment, and you can see that the purchase of new equipment has been decreasing. That's a sign. I mean, these are all just telling you the story of what's going on in the business, right?
Absolutely.
And quite clearly, that story is being told in their financial statement. Now, that's historical. I mean, those financial statements, by the time you're looking at them, are a look to the past.
Yep.
One of my favorite valuation expressions is, history's interesting, but not always relevant.
Absolutely.
Right. It's just leading you to the question that you might want to ask, right?
And touching on that, that history might not be relevant, what would be some examples where the financial statements really aren't indicative of valuation because maybe the world's changed? Where are some of those changes?
So in diligence work that we do, here at our firm at Kalos, in any valuation assignment, actually, you're going to hear the expression of normalizing earnings.
Right.
So when you look back through, say, 5 years of financials for any business, there's a series of normalizing adjustments. That might be an extraordinary contract. Let's say you're supplying, one of the major pipeline development projects. Those projects have finite life, or provide safety services to industrial plant sites, and they schedule turnarounds, and you can forecast that there's 3 turnarounds coming this year and you're going to have great revenue. Those sectors get impacted due to other political or economic circumstances that cause some uncertainty or slowdown in those industries. Then maybe some of those activities that they're going to take on, like the turnaround, for example, or a pipeline expansion, for example, they might just get deferred or put on hold, or maybe never come to fruition at all.
Right.
So you look at a company that did really well for a couple of years because they're servicing a major construction project or what have you, and then all of a sudden things flatten out because no, that was that one big project and we didn't get another one to replace it,
Right.
for example, right? So
Yeah.
but yeah, it could be black swan event, if that's what you want to call COVID, for example. Those ones are a little bit more apparent in terms of the need to normalize. Things were going really well. You're down in the ditch for a couple of years, but you've seen how it recovers. That's actually quite informative to evaluator because it does show resilience. It shows the ability that you're able to live through the trough and come back out, and now you're back running again, right?
Absolutely.
But anytime you look back through historical financial statements, you're trying to understand what's the story that needs to be told here.
Right. And Drew, thinking about the people aspect. So, possibly there's an external or non-family executive team that's been engaged. And from a valuation perspective, how important are those people and the stability of those people in their roles?
Yeah, I'd say hugely important. Kind of ties to what I mentioned earlier around exit planning. But if you have a business that's still wholly dependent on an owner managed or a small, long-term senior management team, anyone that's looking to perhaps invest into that business or buy that business outright is going to look to how the contributions of those people can be replaced. So I wanted to share, again, just to remind, I guess, that the concept of valuation is a prospective concept, right? It's about the future. And it's a very simple formula. You have an expectation for future cash flows, and there's risk and uncertainty attached to those cash flows.
Right.
So, the valuator literally goes in under both sides of that equation and says, well, what's our expectation here of maintaining this level of business, right? Again, it might tie to those individuals. If there's key individual dependence, then that goes to the other side of the equation, the risk side of the equation, right?
Yes.
If there's 5 key customers and there's a lot of dependence on those customers and maybe 1 or 2 product lines, that goes to the risk side of the equation. So say those things in the inverse. If you've got a really well diversified revenue base, strong, like I said earlier, customer base, professional processes and sales force in place that have deep embedded relationships broadly across the organization, those are all things that go to the risk rate as well, but in a positive way.
Absolutely.
So yeah, key person dependence is obviously a consideration of the evaluator, same as key customer dependence.
Right. Now, thinking on the people side of things as well, from a board perspective, and I know you've done some governance work,
Mm-hmm.
where does valuation play when it comes to boards, specifically private companies? And typically, I think what I have seen in the past is on transfer of ownership, there's a change of board. But thinking of board and their duty to the company, what sort of things should they be looking at from what we're talking about here?
My experience with that, Corey, is it's often maybe not as apparent as it should be at the boardroom table.
Okay.
It's indirect because every board will say they address strategy.
Right.
Every board understands that strategy is ultimately a board responsibility. I'm not sure they take it far enough applying valuation concepts, valuation principles to actually think about value creation. And probably the biggest buzzword I'm hearing today in private equity, in the context of private equity capital, is value creation. So there's a very tangible focus now, partly because, hold times for investee company assets are tending to be a little longer maybe than they'd originally intended. And they're finding they have to operate these businesses longer maybe than they had planned on. I'm not saying that value creation wasn't part of their mantra, but maybe from financial leverage or some synergy capture, that's kind of the low hanging fruit. That's traditional ways of creating value in private equity consolidation, for example. But when you actually have to start owning and operating assets for a longer period of time than you anticipated, really focusing on what do we truly mean by value creation?
Right.
That gets at least another layer deep into process design, optimizing processes, investment and enabling of technologies, et cetera, right? And that's what we're seeing play out today, more so than we have in the past.
Right. Now, oftentimes in board formation, we're looking for people who have certain expertise in areas like deploying technology, and risk is a big thing as well from boards. But if family was looking at, they want to establish an independent board or bring some people on, maybe there's some family tied directors that are going to be appointed as well. What are the sort of things that they might want to be thinking about that, maybe isn't going to the director school and getting some of that formal knowledge, but hey, I think that this is important for me to be thinking about valuation on an ongoing basis. And those drivers, as you mentioned, of not just cash flow, but also some of those risk measures.
Not all boards are equal. I think I'll start with that. I think there's a whole spectrum available from truly advisors that you want to surround yourself with as a business owner. And you might call that an advisory board. I like to call it, more like an advisory panel. If you're really not looking to be governed, but you're really looking for some adjunct perspective. And then on the continuum, all the way to maybe what I'll call a full governance board that's executing on, their full scope of fiduciary responsibility. What might be different, I think the more mature companies, I'll start on that other end. The more mature companies that have a more formal governance structure and a more fiduciary board, most of this, I'd say all of the executive skills that they need to run that business should exist within the management.
Yeah.
Now you could and should supplement it maybe with board perspective, but I'll contrast that to a private business that maybe can't afford to have that same depth of an executive team. And that's why I go back to more that concept of the advisory panel, where maybe they supplement the management capabilities by having some advisors that can bring in those perspectives. Or maybe those advisors are even contract, fractional executives, for example, right?
Yeah.
I think the main thing is, really to pick up on your point, is to identify what are the experience gaps that we have. And I'll look at it from a positive side, like what are the opportunities? Like right now, for example, if you're not somehow enabling generative AI in your business planning, you're probably falling behind. Now, does the board member have to be deep in AI? Maybe, maybe not. Depends on maybe the size, sophistication of the business. But someone somewhere in the talent pool should be conversant with generative AI and how it's impacted not only on business performance and business operations, but perhaps this goes back to the board level, how it might impact your strategy. There are businesses that could be hugely disrupted, if not fully disintermediated by these emerging technologies. And if I'm a board member that's not bringing those conversations to the board table, then I'm not doing my job.
Absolutely. And that goes back to your point of staying current, is how important that is.
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah. And where would a consultant fit in? Maybe they don't have that talent. They know they need to be looking at this. Is that viewed as a strength of that they've engaged management consultants for certain subject matter expertise to work on components of the business?
From a evaluator's perspective, you mean?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, 100%. Again, I'm looking for a management team that demonstrates that currency that I'm looking for. Like they understand what's going on. And let's say every risk can be turned on its head to opportunity.
Right.
So, and it goes back to my three levels of people, right? Who's making it happen and who's watching it happen and who doesn't know what happened.
Yeah. Well, and going back to your comment about capital structure, I think, as you said, every risk can be an opportunity. And your comment about debt, and oftentimes people don't pay attention to their capital structure. You made comment of common shares. Oftentimes the exposure to preferred share in a lot of privately held businesses or family enterprises comes from a succession tool. But there's so many different things to be looking at from that perspective. And so can we touch on some of that where maybe that fearful, scary thing can actually be a significant opportunity?
I think you're right to touch on creativity that can exist in your capital structure. Like you mentioned preferred shares. I mean, you can have multiple classes of preferred shares without being all geeky accounting on you. Like, a preferred share can itself have a lot of creativity. It can be participating or not. It can be voting or not. It can have dividends or not. Dividends can be cumulative or not,
Right.
right? They can be layered, a preferred A, a B, C, D. So where they sit in we call it the capital stack, which is really your claim on the company's assets.
Yep.
So, and in all cases, preferred shares sit higher in the capital stack than common equity in terms of having that's why they're called
Yep.
preferred charge on assets. And, but they would sit subordinate to higher rating collateralized debt, like your traditional line of credit, maybe an asset backed loan, et cetera, right? So when I see a mature capital structure, I see a business that really has been taking advantage of optimum financing and capital structures, which, again, from the valuer perspective, is a means towards increasing value. The most efficient capital structure aligns with being properly valued.
Yeah. And being exit ready, what sort of things would a buyer be looking at? You made comments of line of credit, but what about, some of that debt structure? Maybe there's certain covenants that, oh man, the bank required this, but geez, those terms weren't really what's going to allow us to be flexible, and maybe it detracts from value, or there's some old share structure there that needs to be cleaned up, and this becomes a detractor of value. Is there examples where you can, or am I off base on any of that?
No, you're right on base. That's why I mentioned earlier, like often the first normalizing adjustment that and I'll stick with a private equity example, would be how the capital structure would change under their ownership. So let's say they're buying a business that really maybe didn't take advantage of leverage at all because the owner manager's aversion to debt. A private equity or, just say any other investor coming in that has any kind of a risk appetite would come in and say, yeah, I'm going to lever that up, right? What does that do? It allows them to pull cash out and replace it with relatively lower cost financing, again, relative to equity. Um, so two things really change. One is putting more, I'm just going to say, generally speaking, maybe putting more debt in as a way of financing the business. But because of often these buyers are larger and they come from syndicates or larger asset-backed pools, they can also get better rates. So not only are they able to put more debt on, lever the business more, but they can do so at even better rates, right?
And taking that a little bit further, what if we were talking to a family that maybe just wanted to take some chips off the table? Maybe they didn't want to sell the entire business, and now they're looking at, you know, probably it would be investment capital, not strategic buyer at that point.
Mhm.
But what would that look like? And what are some of the things that you've seen that still is favorable to the family, allows the business to mostly stay in the family, but maybe provides them some liquidity to execute on some of their other priorities?
Yeah, I mean, there's two parts to that. One is the structure of the transaction itself. Absolutely, there can be a mechanism that allows for some liquidity as new capital is being provided. They're introducing a new third party. So does come back to kind of some rules of engagement. Is that a passive investor, or are they going to they're going to want, depends on maybe how material, an interest is. If it's a minority interest, then they're just going to let it ride. Or it's strategic capital, like you mentioned, and they're actually going to want to maybe have a voice at the table, which ties back to governance. Maybe they, in most cases, that means having a board seat or two. Often there's an aversion to losing control, right? And it's a bit of a tightrope because, you want liquidity, you don't want to give up control.
Right.
You want to take advantage of their experience and knowledge because you're adding some new perspective, but you don't want to lose control, right?
Yep.
So it's a balance, and it really depends on how far that, I guess, how great that liquidity objective, really is. You talked about preferred shares. I mean, there are mechanisms to bring in new investors, maybe through subordinated loan, subordinate to the bank or primary lender, but it's still injected some, call it capital, into the business, or a preferred shareholder who's got a specified claim on the asset. And, again, I talked about voting or not or whatever, but again, they put capital in, allowing capital to be taken out from the common pool.
Yep.
So they don't have to come in as common equity holders. They could come in as a debt player. They could come in as a preferred shareholder. I guess it really perhaps depends on how much liquidity. If it's a generational change, there's going to be more risk to that party that's bringing in new capital. Like,
Absolutely.
wait a minute, we don't know. We know how this business performed in the past, but now we've got new leadership of a new generation. So that might influence the type of capital position they'd be willing to take.
Right.
Without having a stronger voice, right? Because these all go hand in hand, right? But
Yeah. Yeah. And so one thing that I just heard you say is how important that succession of leadership in the management role is. And maybe that happens prior to a succession of ownership. In this case, if there is outside capital, that outsider would want to see a bit of a track record of that next generation and that stability of those people in those seats.
yeah, if you've got an owner manager who used to be the chief operating officer or the chief executive officer, who is stepping back from the business and putting in place what I'll call a third party or independent new executive to run the business, there's a period of transition there where you need to really watch it play out to see whether that business can continue to not only sustain itself, but hopefully grow. And if you're providing capital into a changing dynamic like that, you want to make sure that that capital A is being appropriately rewarded in terms of coupon rate or whatever, and B is appropriately secured in where it sits in that capital stack.
Right. Now, Gerard, as we near the end of our conversation today, there's a few questions that I ask each guest before we wrap up. Are you ready for the tough ones?
Sure.
All right. What is one key strategy that you believe is most essential for building a successful family enterprise?
We touched on it earlier, Corey. Like I'm just a huge fan of robust communication. Alignment. If I had to put one word, I'd say alignment. Ensuring that there's alignment to purpose, alignment on values, alignment on the strategy, and trust and robust communication.
Love it. And what is the most common challenge that you see family enterprises encountering when it comes to wealth transition and generational continuity?
I can take all of those initial comments and play them back in reverse. Perhaps that alignment hasn't been there. There hasn't been enough communication. I'd summarize it by saying, engage that next generation early.
Yep.
So that those values are embedded. They understand the organizational purpose. I know you've had other podcast conversations around the importance of like a family constitution.
Yep.
But that's really just a tool and a mechanism for getting everyone on the same page. The challenge is when they're not on the same page, when there may be differing financial objectives or otherwise between generations. And I think sometimes there's an expectation that Gen 2 or Gen 3 want to carry on with the business as a legacy business. but maybe they're not as emotionally attached to the vision of business as the founders were.
Right.
Right. And
Yes.
these are difficult conversations to have, but they need to be had because, in my experience, it's at times the kind of the elephant in the room.
Right.
You talked about maybe just wanting some liquidity and maybe wanting to do something different. I think open, honest, transparent conversations as a family. There's another favorite expression I have, which I'll actually attribute to one of my partners at friends at Ozone, Darren Rawson. When we do family enterprise work, he asks this question: is it a family business or is it a business investment of the family?
Love it.
And I don't think that's always really clear.
Absolutely. Yeah. I don't think the family defines that well. And when you talk about alignment, if they're not discussing that topic, then there's different answers amongst all those members for sure.
Yeah. And, I can expand on that a little bit. I mean, that's the example of maybe Gen 2 or Gen 3 doesn't want to stay involved in the business. Doesn't mean the family has to sell the business. That's that move towards, maybe third party management. Maybe you bring in some third party capital to provide some liquidity, but as an asset or investment in the family trust or in the family estate, you still want that investment interest, be carried. Sure, that can be done, right?
Absolutely. And in your experience, what are the top three qualities that successful family enterprise leaders possess?
I kind of went to entrepreneurship in general, to be honest, as I think about this, because I think what I attribute to an entrepreneur is really a family owned business leader, a founder. So the ones who I believe have been the most successful have enhanced governance or have enhanced differing perspectives, willing to listen and learn and surround themselves with other smart people. They have a vision for the business, their courage, they have courage, which goes to their risk taking, like to be risk takers, a certain tenacity that just allows them to, when I talked about resilience earlier, right? Like that tenacity to just stay at it when times get tough, because times will get tough. I did want to quickly flip that on its head though, because those are all the positive aspects. Qualities I've seen that can be challenging for entrepreneurs and family enterprise leaders is ego can get in the way, which leads to kind of a stubbornness.
Right.
So that's kind of the counter of being open to take perspective from others, right? And sometimes risk taking to a fault. Sometimes no really should send you a signal, but most entrepreneurs and family enterprise leaders, when they're challenged and they hear no, the stubbornness kicks in, and sometimes no means no. They
Right.
don't always maybe hear that the way they should.
I love that. Yeah, risk taking to a fault. We talked about aspects of risk and it can go too far. So that's fantastic.
Yeah.
And before we conclude our discussion, I'd like to highlight where our listeners can engage more of the conversations that you're having, or, in your comment of staying current, some of the things that you're reading and paying attention to.
Sure. I mean, I'm just an avid reader of anything, to be honest. I subscribe to probably a dozen different online news services. So I wake up every morning to whatever the headline of the day is. I mean, I'm a big fan of just following B&M, Bloomberg, and I'm a big fan of McKinsey. There's literally daily materials that come out. Following a lot of generative AI now, there's various sites that provide kind of daily insights into the evolution of these generative AI tools, which just blows my mind. Every day I read about a new tool that's doing something new, right?
Agreed.
So there's a proliferation of stuff available to us now. Personally, I love to network. Happy to engage with everyone. I'm an active member with our ICD chapter here in Calgary, the Institute of Corporate Directors. So I like to surround myself with people who are smarter than me, which is not hard to do. I stay active. I mean, I'm an advisor at Kalos. We do transaction advisory, transaction diligence, valuation. So I mean, I'm staying current in the work that we're doing, and we're doing some really interesting, great work right now. Some really interesting work with First Nations as well. And then as well, I act as a chair for MacKay Executive Forums. So I facilitate two peer groups. One is for executives, one is for CEOs. And I get to stay current and listen. I'm literally listening on a real-time basis on the types of issues and challenges that executives are facing personally, professionally. I have lots of avenues to stay grounded, let alone, my own personal life. Like my family, my wife, my children are active in the Calgary community, and I have lots of friends that are still part of the establishment. I'll call it a big four accounting firm. So I don't say no to an invitation. If I have an opportunity to get out and engage and learn, I take it.
Fantastic. And I wanted to make sure that we covered everything today. Is there anything else that we didn't get a chance to cover that you'd like to share with our audience?
I think we covered everything, Corey. I guess I'm really hoping to demystify the concepts of value. How do we define value? And maybe I'll just come back to that again. And because I think if people are hardwired to just, really think and anchor their decisions every day around how does this align to our strategy? Therefore, read that as saying, how does this align to value? Value is about risking future cash flows. So what can we do in our business to make it more resilient, to create a little bit more certainty around future cash flow, make the investments that we need to make that are going to pay off, in the longer term, and, truly understanding what our unique, sustainable competitive advantages so that we are confident every day that as leaders, as owners, and as employees, that we're going in and growing value in the business every day.
Fantastic. Well, great final words. As we wrap up, I'd just like to thank you, Gerard, for taking the time to share your expertise and experiences with us today. Your insights have been incredibly valuable to me, and I'm sure our listeners will be grateful for your contribution to this episode. So thank you.
Well, thank you, Corey. I really enjoy your podcast series. I'm honored that you asked me to participate. So thank you.
As we wrap up this episode, we invite you to reflect on the valuable conversation we shared with Gerard about unique dynamics of valuation and strategy within family businesses. Whether you are part of a family enterprise or provide consulting to family enterprises, Gerard's perspective offer practical approaches to enhancing business value through strategic thinking and optimized capital structures. Throughout our discussion, Gerard highlighted the importance of staying current and embracing appropriate risk for family enterprise sustainability. His insights explored how value creation extends beyond financial statements to include transferable knowledge and resilient management teams. By viewing business through a valuation lens, he emphasized the need for forward-looking mindsets that balances financial stewardship with strategic growth. Our conversation ultimately revealed how applying valuation principles to everyday decisions can help family enterprises build sustainable value that transcends generations. For families seeking expertise in business valuation, strategy, and governance, Gerard McInnis and his team at Kalos are ready to help. We've included his contact information and additional resources in the show notes to support you on your journey. Thank you for joining me, Corey Gagnon, your host of Legacy Builders Podcast. It's my personal passion to explore with you these topics related to family wealth. If you enjoyed today's episode, you can subscribe on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or your preferred podcast platform. And don't forget to share this episode with family, friends, and colleagues who you care about. If you'd like to help support this show, you can do so by leaving a rating and review. If you have any questions about anything shared on today's episode, or have topics you'd like us to dive deeper into in future episodes, please let us know by emailing beaconfamilyoffice@asante.com. That's beaconfamilyoffice@ASSANTE.com. Legacy Builders, Strategies for Building Successful Family Enterprises is brought to you by Beacon Family Office at Asante. Are you worried about losing what you've created and seeking ways to transition your wealth across generations? Beacon Family Office at Asante supports our clients transition their wealth while maintaining relationships. If you'd like to access more content we've created, you can visit us at beaconfamilyoffice.com or for more details on our services and book an initial call. Thanks again for listening, and until next episode, stay intentional about building your legacy. This program was prepared by Corey Gagnon, who is a senior wealth advisor with Beacon Family Office at Asante Financial Management Limited. This is not an official program of Asante Financial Management, and the statements and opinions expressed during this podcast are not necessarily those of Asante Financial Management. This show is intended for general information only and may not apply to all listeners or investors. Please obtain professional financial advice or contact us at beaconfamilyoffice@asante.com or visit beaconfamilyoffice.com to discuss your particular circumstances prior to acting on the information presented.